We do it every single morning. Yep, we wake up. But something else is going on here. I mean, Buddha, the whole concept of enlightenment is about the one who's awake. Waking up. It's the most difficult thing to do and the most natural. Because what human beings are, what consciousness is a process. And we're inside that process. And believe it, you all know this. You know, consciousness is a house of mirrors full of smoke and distorted reflections and all these tricks. And 4.5 billion years ago, life emerged and it became. And then out of it became awareness of itself, consciousness. That's where we are. And here we've talked over time about being in accord. In accord with what? What exactly does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. What are we waking up to? What are we all are noticing, are modifying, are differentiating and synthesizing and seeing finer orders of complexity? What is all of this noticing really about? What are we putting ourselves in accord with? Now, I'm convinced that what we're doing is learning the language of nature herself. Noticing. And I want to keep that word to the front of our mind, noticing. Because what's happened in the last 500, 600 years is this unbelievable event that I can only call the Great Awakening. From Galileo to Leeuwenhoek. Leeuwenhoek, by the way, is the microscope dude. He is to the microscope what Galileo was to the telescope. We discovered worlds upon worlds. We discovered finer gradations of nature herself. I'm convinced nature can teach us how to solve most of our problems. Look at flight. Look at the evolution of waking from Da Vinci to the Wright brothers. An amazing story. And if you look at the inside world of Leeuwenhoek, who was it that first noticed if you took a piece of moldy bread and you put it on your bullet wound, that wound would not get infected, or at least the odds of it? And how long between that noticing until Fleming comes up with the penicillin? And now we have the CRISPR gene, and we've recognized in all ways that not only is biodiversity important and integral to living and taking a breath, but so is microdiversity. What we are waking to, what human consciousness is doing. You see, we have become, and this is what we've learned, that we are both a partner with nature and nature's finest expression, looking back on herself. And we're learning something. You see, once we became self-aware, this process was set into motion that it cannot be undone. And what we're doing is we're recognizing the interconnectedness of everything. What are we putting ourselves in accord with? The interconnectedness, the oneness of being itself. And we've gone through all kinds of understandings, all the different gods, you know, the great animation where everything became a god. Then there was the big earth god, and then there was the big sky god. These were contexts of meanings of trying to see what was happening and how it was happening, that we might move with it, and she might take care of us as we take care of her. This week I kept thinking, wow, is everyone just a Vishnu floating on an anaconda in the sea of bliss, growing different incarnations and expressions of being and life? Man, it's a trip to just think about this stuff. Now look, I just laid out a whole bunch, but I want everyone to know that what makes us human is this reaching for some kind of ultimate understanding of our place in the universe and why the hell we're here, and to create a healthier and more holistic life. And none of us is alone, because consciousness isn't just what you have. Consciousness and what you think you have is a part of a larger process. And waking up is participating in this process place where consciousness fulfills its most true nature, where being through life becomes in greater and greater awareness, a literal font of reaching and becoming more. Whatever it is you have and whatever it is that's going on in your life, something in us is reaching for more, a greater understanding, and to slowly become more intentional in the very process of this integral relationship between both being a partner with nature and being nature's finest piece, because we're not just putting ourselves in touch, in accord with interconnectedness. We are the interconnectedness. And there's ways of seeing this and participating in it. And so today we want to talk about waking up. I just laid out a whole lot, my cohorts, Bob Hayes and Marianne Rudis. Bob, what say you in this great font that I just belched onto the podcast?
Well, it's really difficult to put into a few words, and you've packed a lot into a few paragraphs. But when I think about the term waking up, I think it really means becoming more aware of ourselves and the world around us. And you can look from the psychology side through Freud and Jung and a number of other great thinkers whose idea we need to make our unconscious processes more conscious. We need to see where we have disrupted our behavior by the things that we have suppressed or have not been able to come to grips with. And then you look at it from the side of the Zen masters who said we need to be totally aware of the moment and where we are in the larger process and how we fit into that without judging. And then can you have awareness of something? Can you wake up and become more aware of something without judging it, without saying it's good or bad, that it just is and that you're part of it? And the more awake we become, the more, you use the term interconnectedness, the more we see and begin to be able to participate in that interconnectedness.
Amen.
So it's a very complex topic, obviously.
Well, every thread we pull on seems to go to the same place, and it's this place of deep mystery and of bringing in every other issue we've talked about into play. So Marianne, on the point of this process place of waking up, what say you?
Well, I have to agree with what both of you have said, that being aware of things is part of that whole idea of waking up, but also being aware of who and what we are. And I think that kind of goes back to it's a core understanding, and it goes back to the idea of the self-work that we need to do in order to bring those unconscious things in that are happening within us into our consciousness. And then once we can do that, understanding that we are interconnected, we are part of everything that is happening. We're part of this process, not good or bad, like you mentioned, Bob, but just it just is. And so when we think of this, and I think you said this, Red Hawk, that we're an expression of nature, we are an expression of life. But I think there's something more that's happening, and that's where that consciousness piece. And as we start to wake up and to kind of understand that what I do, what I think, what I say affects not just me, but everyone else. And when we can start to think of our actions as being beneficial to the collective, rather than just for ourselves, that's where we start to be awake to that interconnectedness. Because what I do to you, I am doing to me. And what you do to me, you are doing to yourself. And so, and again, the golden rule just popped into my head. We kind of go back to that whole idea that we are responsible for ourselves and each other. And to go back to the religious language, we are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper.
Yeah.
We are nature's keeper, and nature is our keeper.
Yeah.
And that's the journey, I think.
Yeah. And you bring in the front lines of waking, which is the self. Because the fact is, I don't believe we know what the self really is. So I could say stuck, but I don't feel like it's stuck. Actually, it feels freeing because I'm not stuck to a definition, but I'm seeing the self as selfing and creating self after self, and I can watch that. I can participate in watching that. And I think that's how we each create our own personal myth, our own personal story, is through all these layers of re-selfing. But I think it's important for us to realize that the front lines of waking is where that inner world is doing things. As Marianne, as you were talking, one of the things that I really see in Western scripture is the Hebrews. And the Hebrew scriptures talk about the behavior is what matters. And if you don't do it, it doesn't matter. Jesus comes along and takes a new order of things and says, even thinking about it makes you guilty of it. And that's a different, more finer, nuanced place. And this tells us something about the nature of waking, because what happens in waking is all these bits of content come in and are evaluated. Sometimes we have the judger of good and bad, but the real judgment is healthy or not. And we're still trying to figure out what constitutes healthy. So that's a whole other layer of it. But the bits come in until there's enough of them to create a larger context. You begin to see how they fit together. This is where Einstein was. The people before him had all these understandings, but there were all these pieces that did not fit, and they put them in a bucket called anomaly. Eventually, in that bucket, all those anomalies had to be reconciled, and that's what Einstein did with special relativity and general relativity. He took those pieces. Now, what happened is his theories created some anomalies, and quantum physics emerged out of trying to assimilate and accommodate those particular anomalies, and he couldn't see it. And so there's this progress to waking in the real world and a resistance to it by the previous wave of waking, if you will. And now let's translate that into our inner life and see how difficult, and again, I started out with waking up is the most difficult thing and the most natural, which is really sucks. Because we're caught at the synapse of the paradox of alpha and omega, it seems to me. Bob?
Let me throw another paradox out there.
Oh boy.
First of all, waking is not a single thing. It's not. You can use the metaphor of waking up in the morning, or waking up from a nap, or waking up from an unconscious state, or so forth. But it's never the end state. You're constantly awaking to new and broader and better levels of understanding. And the danger is that when you wake up and you think that you've got it, and then you start taking actions that end up feeding back in a negative way. Let me give you an example. The idea of defund the police. Someone awakened to the idea that the way the police force is organized was not working, that they couldn't deal with mental health issues, that they couldn't deal with family issues. They weren't trained for it, and they weren't equipped for it. And that was an awakening thought. But they took that thought and then said, all right, what are we going to do with it? We're going to come up with a slogan, defund the police, which ended up becoming so negative that it fed back to a large segment of the population and caused them to even suppress the idea of reforming or improving the police. They could focus on that defund aspect. One of my heroes is Greta Thunberg, who just went to the latest climate conference, and she and a group of her cohorts started chanting, "Take your climate crisis and shove it up your arse." And they were chanting that. And I understand what they're trying to get at. They're saying, oh, you've talked about a climate crisis for 50, 60 years and you haven't done anything about it. But as soon as they start chanting, "Take your climate crisis and shove it up your arse," then it gives the opponents a weapon to use against those who really wish to take positive action. So again, we have to be very careful as we are awakening that we don't act in ways that are negative toward the collective.
Well, and now you're talking about marketing, and that's a whole different thing. The real issue.
It's also beyond marketing. It's the awareness, the awakening to the idea that these interconnections bring in people with different ideas and aren't going to see it exactly like you did.
Right. And that's part of
that in itself is an awakening thought.
And that's part of, I think, the diversity that's needed to bring to these issues. However, it's very hard to bring those issues to mind without the message being reduced in such a way that it can be used in a negative way. Go ahead, Mary Ann.
Well, as you were talking about this, what comes to my mind is, first of all, that the way we're trying to come at problems is through an unawakened system. So when people looked at the police departments, to use your example, Bob, and said defund the police, they were thinking of that in terms of money. That was the bottom line. That was how we were going to get that message across. And so it got distorted because that message was coming from a distorted place. And for us to be able to wake up and to be aware, we have to have these messages coming from a new place, an idea of interconnectedness, an idea of love, that money is not the bottom line. It's not about taking money away from the police. It's about taking the police department and really imagining what that whole system should look like.
Yeah, and I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds here.
I know, but thinking about it's all about waking up to the fact that we have to start thinking in new ways. We can't keep using the old paradigm. And as you were talking, Red Hawk, my mind went to observers and the idea that when you get into the whole quantum thing and Schrodinger's cat and all that kind of stuff, where you start to recognize that how we're observing things and what we're bringing, each one of us is bringing to the collective matters. And when we start to get that, we take that personal responsibility that it is our job to wake up ourselves. And that's the only way we're going to wake up the rest of the world.
And now you brought it back to the point that I want to really address over and over, and that's we are learning to wake up to waking up. What you all have just laid out is all these resistances to waking up and how we confound the message to create opportunity for more resistance and things like that. However, there's a point in us, and this is the story that we need. We know the stories of resistance. Man, that's a story they've been told for so many generations we can't fathom it. But the story of how people wake up, I mean, we've got the Buddha, we've got Lao Tzu, we got Jesus, we got the prophets, we got Muhammad, we got all these, examples, if you will, of people who made waking up the whole gig and trying to bring other people along to some degree. And I'm suggesting we're at another junction, but it's not going to be great people or a person. It's going to be choirs of people. It's going to be small circles like us that keep saying there's new ways of thinking about things. And what we've done here on this podcast is we've tried to just lay out some different ways of thinking about stuff that were more inclusive, that brought in all the religious traditions, all of what science is trying to bear. And today's thread that we're pulling on is waking up, this process place in us that allows us to even wake up to the resistance to our waking up. And I mean, that's what you all are talking about. And, that's where the news people are really missing it by addressing white supremacy. Like it's something, and they don't address it within the context of resistance to so much change that's going on. And I think when we develop, and this is where the storytellers come in, we develop stories that people can hold close to their own life because there's pieces of it that relate to it. That those narratives of being connected, walking with the interconnectedness of life, realizing inside yourself those places that aren't healthy, and being able to bring some awareness to them and some healing power instead of just a defense mechanism that can protect you from it. Those pieces to me are huge. And Marianne, I think what you just laid out is a perfect example of how we wake to waking. And I think that's part of our time. When I talk about this from Copernicus to now, we're in a time of the Great Awakening. We're seeing the context in which life really came to be, and we're struggling for new meanings because the old meanings seem to have fallen away. And I think that's part of what this podcast is about. I want folks to know they're not alone. We're all in this shift together. Many of us have the same type of experiences of the oneness and the mystical nature of being, but we don't have a language that reflects our time. We have to go back to Buddha's language, or the language of the Vedas, or the Upanishads, or the mystics in Christianity. We're reaching, we're waking up, and this is part of waking up. It doesn't just notice things, it makes something new out of them. And we're just now noticing, and the storytellers are the ones that will begin making new stories out of this. And I think, sci-fi, I'm sorry, I keep going back to that, but those storytellers are taking things from a different order of understanding, and it works for me. All of them do.
There's some great. Yeah. Yeah.
I just got a notice saying someone in this podcast might need a booster shot.
Interesting.
What?
Waking up. Think of that though. We're waking up, and something just reminded me, and I have a scheduled appointment for my booster, but that's part of, you're not alone, man. We're all doing this together. And this internet thing, and I've shared this thought before, it's the hardwiring of the planet. It's the nervous system. When someone drops a bomb or steps on a landmine in some obscure country, I know about it immediately, just like I know when I drop something on my foot that I've just dropped something on my foot. This is a waking up at a whole different level. Bob, you brought the climate change stuff up. I think that is a whole order of waking up to waking up. We're now putting more power and credentials and credence in those scientists who are dealing with these changes. It's really, and I think this needs to be a hopeful podcast. Man, we're doing some cool stuff, and if people are doing their inner work, and where the rubber hits the road, and I think that's where it is, then I think the world, even in the midst of this crazy resistance that we're getting, the world is trying to break through to a new order of understanding. Am I reaching too far in that?
Or an old order of understanding. maybe not a new one, something that has been with us forever that we have forgotten. Because when you look at the evolution of humanity, when we try to figure things out, we have dismantled things. We've taken out the parts and we tinker with the parts, and we think that's going to fix problems. And if you think about that in medicine, you think about, I'll just fix the liver, but we don't care about the heart, right? And so, the way I'm fixing this part is damaging another. And I think we're getting back to, now that we have pulled things apart, now we're getting back to a synthesis that wait a minute, there is a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts,
and we're understanding it, and we're understanding it,
parts.
And we're understanding it more in terms of scientific things that we can show beyond a method, with a methodology of their true. And Marianne, what you just defined right there was the true definition of religion. Religion comes from religare, which is to relink. What we have done is relinked to exactly what you're talking about, to an affect. In other words, the ancients had an affect for it better than we did, but they didn't have a language that could speak it with the kind of authority that science can speak. So the circle...
Because we couldn't intellectually get it, right? We couldn't intellectually figure it out. And so we had to go in and bring our intellect to what we have always known intuitively. And now that the intellect and the intuitive are combining, it's becoming validated. And it's something that's around.
It's like the human family's going, duh, we really are partners. Oh, wait, we are nature herself, where she becomes aware of herself, and we're destroying the very fabric that gives rise to us doing that. That's some profound waking that needs to happen, that's existentially critical. And I think that's the piece that is that comes to the front of my heart over and over, is that waking before could be left to the few who took the time to do it, and we do not have the luxury of that. We now can't have a waking class. We have to have a waking human family, that we might keep the body of the substance alive. My grandson learned the word atmosphere over the last couple weeks, and we're out walking, and he'll say, "Take a breath, Grandpa." And I'll take a breath. He goes, "Atmosphere."